Hi, I'm Chip Hardwick. I am the Synod Executive for the Synod of the Covenant, and I want to welcome you to this workshop with the Reverend Dr. Jerusha Neal. Will be excited to introduce her more fully in a minute, but Jerusha, we're so glad you're here with us and look forward to learning from you. I want to tell you a little bit about what's going on in the life of the Synod before I turn it over to Jerusha. So I'm going to share my screen, tell you about some exciting news that we have going forward for 2023 and 2024. If someone could let me know if you see that on your screen. Yep, great, thank you. So we're in the process. I just got the list of the winners of our Matthew 25 grants yesterday. We're giving away $50,000 to churches who are working towards congregational vitality or against structural racism and systemic poverty. And there were 38 applicants and 17 awardees. So if you have applied, you'll hear back from us soon, but whether you were one of those. We also have, if you need boundaries training still this year, there's one more left. It is next week, but it's not too late to sign up. You can.
Yeah, I'm here.
I'm going to mute you, Barb. There you go. There's boundaries training that you can sign up for. That's next week. That'll be our last one of the year. So if you need to take that, don't miss it. We are doing a virtual worship service for New Year's Eve. So that those of you who are pastoring or musicians or tech people in your churches, we want to give you a break after the busyness of Advent season and provide a meaningful worship service for you. You might know that I had originally announced we would be doing it on December 24th, Advent 4 in the morning, but there was a great outcry of people saying, do it for New Year's Eve instead. And so we're doing it for New Year's Eve. So you can look forward to learning more about that as we get closer. We'll post it probably by the first week of December or so. Then in 2024, here's some exciting things. We're hiring a commissioned ruling elder coordinator at 10 hours a week. This position would work with presbyteries to identify and train and support CREs. This went live on Monday. I've already had 3 calls about it. So if you know somebody who would be great at this, or if you yourself would be great at this and are looking for another way to serve Christ in our midst, let me know. I also have exciting news to tell you about the Lilly Endowment. They are, as you can see, a private philanthropic foundation, and they sent us a check for $1,250,000 I think I got it on Monday of last week. It came in a regular envelope with a regular stamp on it, and it was just a regular check. It was not a cashier's check. And when I talked to our banker, she's like, "Yeah, you could have just scanned it at your desk, like I scanned the $50 checks that we." So anyway, this grant is to fund their compelling preaching initiative, and we in the Synod asked for a grant for a new ministry called Cultivating the Gift of Preaching. We'll identify, train, and support emerging preachers. These are preachers who haven't yet had the gift of rigorous training and preaching within the Synod of the Covenant. And our goal is to have 140 additionally trained preachers throughout the Synod for stated supply, for interim worship, for leadership of small congregations, etc., over the course of 5 years. And it'll begin in summer of 2024. So if there are people in your congregations who have the gift of preaching and would like to learn more how to serve, tell them to watch this space. We're also excited to partner with Alma College, with Johnson C. Smith Seminary. That's our historically Black seminary in the PCUSA that's in Atlanta, and with the Presbytery of Cincinnati on this. And we're hiring a half-time project director for this to implement the structure and execute the vision for the Cultivating the Gift of Preaching ministry. So again, if you know someone who would be good at this, they could contact me. Here's our information. If you don't already receive our newsletter, that's the best way to hear about things going on in the life of the Synod. But you can also go to our website or Facebook or YouTube. And here's my information. I'll also put it in the chat in case you would like to reach out to me directly. I am really excited to introduce Jerusha Neal to you. Jerusha is an assistant professor of homiletics at Duke Divinity School. She is an American Baptist pastor who has served in the Fiji Islands as a Methodist church missionary. So we've got American Baptist, Methodist, Duke is Methodist. She's serving Presbyterians here. So we're excited about your ecumenical background, Jerusha. Her book, The Overshadowed Preacher, Mary, the Spirit, and the Labor of Proclamation, came out in 2020. She's currently writing a book called Holy Ground, Preaching Climate Change and the Apocalypse of Place. And that will be out, or Jerusha's in the middle of writing the last chapter. So we can pray for her. She also has authored a collection of dramatic monologues, Blessed Monologues for Mary. You can see a note from Ed Good that she was a bridesmaid in Ed and Amy's wedding, Amy Snow and Ed Good. But she is best known to me as my speech teaching fellow when I was a junior at Princeton Seminary in 1996. And I was reading a passage from Isaiah 6, the woe, I'm a man of unclean lips, and I live in a people of unclean lips. And of course, I had my regular permagran on, whoa, I am a man of unclean lips, and I live in a people of unclean lips. And Jerusha helped wipe my permagran off my face, encouraged me to practice in the mirror, and really helped me develop a broader range of emotions to show from the pulpit rather than just smiling all the time. So Jerusha, I'm really thankful for you. It's been great to watch your ministry from afar, and I'm so delighted to watch it close up here. So before I turn it over to her, let's pray. Gracious God, thank you so much for what we will learn today. We pray, oh God, that we would be more faithful and effective preachers at the close of this time together than we are now at its beginning. We give you thanks for Jerusha, and we pray in Christ's name. Amen.
Amen.
Let's welcome Jerusha with some happy hands.
Oh, thank you so much. Thank you. I do need to start by saying that, Chip, we love your smile, and I would hate to think that anything I ever said in some ways diminished it, because it's one of my favorite things about you. And as you mentioned, so not only Baptist, not only Methodist, but all of my training was done at Princeton. So I spent a lot of time with Presbyterians as well, and am so grateful for the hospitality that I have received. And some of you, we could cross paths over there. So it's just wonderful to see some friendly faces today. Thank you for this hospitality today. We're going to talk today about hope, exilic hope, and particularly in relation to the climate crisis. And I want to just start by saying what a complicated topic hope is in relation to climate justice preaching, because there's so many ways to get it wrong. Hope can lead to a kind of passivity, a sort of sense of, well, God's got this and we don't really need to deal with it. Hope can also lead to a kind of overblown sense of our own importance, a kind of messianic sense that we're going to go off and change the world with our recycling, in ways that not only can be naive, but also can reinscribe the very power imbalances that got us into this trouble in the first place. And so part of where I want to begin our conversation today is with a class that I have been teaching, co-teaching with, here we go, with a biblical scholar at Duke, Ellen Davis. And we start with some very particular questions about where our students are standing when they come to preach in relation to the climate crisis. The very final assessment in the course is they have to preach in a local congregation in North Carolina, which is very politically diverse. And so there's a lot of anxiety around this sermon from the start. And you begin to hear in these first couple of weeks that we meet together all the reasons this is going to be hard. There's so many challenges, they say, and they're different in different contexts. My congregation is too politicized. This issue will turn people off right from the start. My congregation is too distrustful of this topic. They felt manipulated by it in the past. My congregation is too poor. This is sort of a Whole Foods kind of organic chicken kind of conversation, and my congregation is interested in food on the table and non-perishable can items in their cupboards. Or my congregation is too rich. The pillars in my congregations are actually the heads of industry that would be critiqued in a sermon like this. My congregation is white and we need to be talking about racial justice. My congregation is Black and we need to be talking about racial justice. My congregation is rural and they know more about agriculture and even ecology than I do as a preacher. Who am I to bring this up? I feel scientifically illiterate. Or my congregation is so theologically conservative. Their understanding of salvation is very, very limited to personal spiritual categories. On the other side, some folks said, my congregation's really progressively smug. They felt like they dealt with this in 2004. They're done. They know all there is to know about this subject. Some mention the lectionary, Genesis 1 and Romans 8 only come around so often, right? And so what are we supposed to do? My congregation's too optimistic. They're into cheap hope in relation to this issue. Or my congregation is despairing and afraid. All of these issues. But here's the thing. Over the course of about 2 or 3 weeks, the students shift in terms of what they're willing to risk with us in relation to why this issue is hard for them. And all of a sudden, the issues become about themselves. They start saying things like, I'm too ignorant of the science to really know what to say in this congregation. I'm too ignorant of my congregation and really where they stand in relation to this issue. There's so many issues that this particular topic raises about God that I don't feel equipped to answer. And then finally, about week 3, they get quite honest with us and they says, actually, I don't want to preach about this because I'm afraid. What does a preacher say in the face of the unthinkable? There was a sermon that Bill McKibben preached about 10 years ago, 2013. He was at Riverside Church, and he talked about how the heat trapped by the ozone layer had melted 80% of the summer sea ice that Neil Armstrong saw when he walked on the moon in 1969. One of the largest physical features on Earth, and we've broken it. He preaches. That was 10 years ago. Now, I saw impacts of that during the years that I taught and I preached in the Fijian Islands in the South Pacific, where currently there's about 42 villages that are scheduled for relocation. They're seeing more dangerous storms. They're seeing coral reefs dying. They're seeing landslides in places where that has never happened before. But of course, it's not just halfway around the world. It's here in North Carolina. We see the stronger storms as well. We see migrant workers needing to work in dangerously high heat indexes, often in unsafe conditions. There are pesticides and pollutants. We see an ecosystem breaking apart. And what I want to suggest to you today is that very displacement and kind of exile, that feeling of the ground shifting under your feet and that loss of a land and an ecosystem that we remember, this makes the biblical text more relevant than ever. The biblical text were formed with this roaring question in their minds. Can the creation and covenant of a good God come undone? And the striking thing is that, in passages like Jeremiah 4, it's pretty clear the answer is yes. This is a translation, again, by my colleague Ellen Davis, and here's how it reads. I have seen the earth, and here it is wildness and waste. And I have looked to the heavens, and their light is gone. I have seen the mountains, and here they are wavering, and all the hills palpitate. I have seen and Here there is no human being, and all the birds of the skies have fled. I have seen, and here the garden land is now the wasteland, and all its cities pulled down because of the Lord, because of God's heated wrath. Notice, as you read that passage, the way there is a kind of unraveling of the Genesis 1 account of creation. You have light go, you have mountains waver, you have people go, you have vegetation gone. It's almost like, if you're a knitter, you're sort of frogging the work that you've done, pulling out the stitches. Now, biblical scholars will tell you that first chapter in Genesis was compiled, put together, put at the front of our canon precisely during this season of Jeremiah's tears, that the two texts are actually in dialogical relationship with each other. And I want to just underscore what a difference that makes for how we read Genesis 1. That Genesis 1 is never meant to be this sort of proof that God's people will never be displaced. It is a kind of hope-filled cry of an exiled people that are claiming that God can still breathe life in the face of devastation. It brings an exilic lens to the question of climate justice. What does it mean to be faithful when the land changes under your feet? And where is God when that happens? More significantly, what does God require of us and of God's people? In case you think this is just a sort of Old Testament kind of Hebrew scripture narrative, this exilic hope runs throughout our scriptures. First Peter begins with the letter being addressed to this very specific word that means exiles, refugees, migrants, resident aliens. And that's not just a spiritual metaphor he's using there. The empire has changed. We're now in the Empire of Rome. But Preston Burroughs has a new book out, Creation's Slavery and Liberation, which describes the kind of imperial agricultural practices that Rome used to centralize power in the capital, to centralize its economy, the displacement of whole communities, the razing of forests, the salting of soil. This issue is at the heart of God's people's ache throughout scriptures. Where is God standing? Can God be trusted? What does faithfulness look like? Does human action even matter? What is our hope? What is the good news? And my thesis today, right, is this: that God's solidarity with creation is foundational to the salvation history described in our scriptures. That God's commitment to creation is woven throughout both scriptural testaments. The image here I put in the background is of a tree. I think often we think about climate justice as sort of a branch on a tree of all the missional things we can talk about. We could talk about, race. We can talk about gender. We could talk about inclusion. We could talk about all of these, money, poverty, or we could talk about care for creation. And what I'd like to suggest to you today is that, given the witness of our scripture, that God's solidarity with creation is actually at the root of the tree, that it is part of God's work that God is doing in relation to the restoration of the world, that impacts all of those branches. I'm going to switch metaphors now from trees to icebergs, but I think you can stay with me. That's not often how we preach it. We often preach it, as sort of public theology on an Earth Day. Maybe there's a mission committee update, sort of the tip of the iceberg. But we don't often connect creation care to the old story of this God that loves the world. We don't often connect it to these very big theological words, right, that are so grounded in our life together. Words like soteriology and eschatology and anthropology, new creation, redemption, sanctification. One of the takeaways that I want to share with you from teaching this class with these young preachers in North Carolina is that part of what engaging the climate crisis requires is a linking up of this contemporary crisis with this old story. These deep, big theological words that resonate through our scriptures and through our traditions as a community of faith. This means that I think we need to use those big theological terms. There is not just one right way to do this. Scripture has multiple streams of witness in relation to how God is working in solidarity with creation. Ellen Davis's book stresses covenant, that there is this covenantal claim on us. And because of God's covenantal connection to all flesh, I think of the Noahic covenant, right? And she spells that out there. For some, they really focus on this Christian understanding of reconciliation and reconciliation through the life, death, resurrection of Christ. What would it mean to see the story of creation's reconciliation with God in that frame? And of course, there are scholars like Elizabeth Johnson who are rethinking what creation means and incarnation means in light of the climate crisis. Creation and the Cross is a wonderfully accessible book. It's formed as a dialogue between a professor and a young person who is losing hope in face of the climate crisis. And she talks about deep incarnation. She talks about what it means that Christ's body, because it is flesh, includes in it the atoms of stars, the atoms of frogs and algae. What does it mean to have a God that incarnationally attuned and vulnerable and alongside creation? To do this kind of work means that when you preach on climate, you're moving beyond the Genesis 1, Romans 8 sermon. That you are actually committing to preach about climate care from the whole Bible and in all liturgical seasons. One of the wonderful pieces of this class is you begin to see how many texts lend themselves to this. Again, my colleague Ellen Davis, she's from an Episcopal tradition. She always preaches lectionary. She's often a guest preacher. And she made the commitment for a year to use one of the lectionary texts for a given week when she guest preaches in a exegetically responsible way to address climate, in part because she wanted to witness to the fact that it was possible. And in fact, she did it far easier than I thought it would be. I was a little worried about it at first. And then I realized this is everywhere in our biblical text. These are just some examples of places where sermons came from in this class. What would it mean to integrate this kind of care for creation into the core liturgies and affirmations of our worship? But there was another takeaway as well, not just remembering the old story. One of the key pieces, I think, in exilic hope in the climate crisis is to make the justice connections. Of course, the exile takes place in the context of occupation and displacement of empire. And I think this is a preacher's job at this moment, to make very clear for folks that climate care is racial justice. It is work. It is the eradication of poverty work, and it is decolonial work. This is a picture of Cyclone Winston, which is the strongest cyclone in the southern hemisphere. It hit Fiji when we were there, and there are still folks that are in tents because of that cyclone that hit in 2016. The picture of the flood below is in Princeville, North Carolina, a historically African-American community that was settled in low-lying land because that was the land available to them, that is hit again and again and again with floods when storms hit. There's a very chilling quote at the very start of Rob Nixon's Slow Violence and the environmentalism of the poor. And it's a 1991 memo that Lawrence Summers wrote when he was working at the World Bank. And it says this: I think the economic logic behind dumping a load of toxic waste in the lowest wage country is impeccable. And we should face up to that. Just between you and me, shouldn't the World Bank be encouraging more migration of the dirty industries to the least developed countries? The quote is shocking, but it says what we already know to be true, which is that this crisis disproportionately impacts Black and brown bodies all over the world. Folks that are already vulnerable, previously colonized areas of the world, these are the folks on the front line. But it requires preachers to make that link because congregations don't always see it. This is a sermon preached in a Black church setting by Howard John Wesley. You'll notice that the name of the sermon is I Can't Breathe. And in it, he is speaking about climate justice in the context of systematic violence against the Black community. What does it mean to make that link? And this is a very faithful biblical link. One of the things right out of our scriptures is that there is a link between the dehumanization of people and the exploitation of the earth. We don't have time to go into all of these examples today, but we'll just take Egypt, right, as an example. Right at the start of Exodus, what drives Pharaoh's obsession and his fear, precisely the call in Genesis 1 for fruitfulness and multiplication and the thriving of creation. It's precisely the thing that he feels threatened by. And what follows is this dehumanization of persons. Egypt is described as the iron furnace in the Torah. And Davis describes it as the biblical archetype of the industrial society, burning, ceaseless in its demand for slave labor, which was the cheapest fuel of the ancient industrial machine, consumed until it itself was consumed. And of course, you have a similar argument about Rome, described as Babylon in Revelation. One of the reasons why this sort of link between justice and climate is so important is because it's very easy to come up with a solution to climate that only benefits some, that is nowhere near big enough, that it actually leaves the most vulnerable outside of the insulation that those with more resources have provided. And I think when you begin to recognize the bigness of what we're talking about, the entrenched nature of it, it can feel overwhelming. I mean, we've brought these huge theological words onto the table. We brought in the history of colonialism, for goodness sake. I mean, how do we begin to confront this? Which takes me to my third takeaway. When you look at how Scripture describes resistance to empire, there is a consistent honoring of everyday resistance. I want to go back to the story of Exodus. It's very significant that in that first chapter of Exodus, it's this work of ordinary women who are caring for vulnerable children that begin to dismantle this empire that has set itself against creation. I think a careful reading of Exodus knows that it is completely cynical to somehow say that the protection of trees and the protection of children are opposed to each other. The biblical witness is that those things are absolutely aligned. And so one of the things that I would recommend is to keep your eye on women and children in the fight. One of the women that is making a huge difference is Heather McTeer-Toney. She has a new book out that describes climate activism in the African-American community that she knows well. She writes in a New York Times article about how African-American women are taking center stage in this climate fight, and what would it mean to let them lead, and what would it mean to listen with care? These are two advocates for clean, safe water, one from Flint, Michigan, and one from Zimbabwe. You'll notice that's right before COVID began. But it also means paying attention to the very small, vulnerable places where God is at work protecting life. There's a powerful image, refugia here, that Deborah Rienstra describes in her book, Refugia Faith, where she begins to think about an ecclesiology for the climate crisis. And she tells this story about Mount St. Helens. Mount St. Helens erupts, and the scientific community believes that it is going to be decades before anything grows on it again. Maybe 2050, we'll see some regeneration. And yet within 20 years, there's all this life that has grown up on the mountain, and they're trying to figure out why. And what they discover is that there are these tiny places, these cracks where seeds were hidden, where lichen could hide, fissures in the rock that seem very unlikely places to sustain life, and yet made an absolute difference in the restoration of this ecosystem. And Rienstra says, the church can be like that. God loves to work in small, humble faces, and the Refugia model calls us to locate the seed of life where we are, concentrate on protecting and nurturing a few good things so that what is good and beautiful can grow and spread. It calls us to trust God's work. One of the ways in which I have been learning about that small work and appreciating again comes out of the work of Elizabeth Albright. She is a secular scholar at the Nicholas School of the Environment, but she's been in conversation with some Duke theologians around the importance of social networks in local communities. Albright researches the sociology of climate change. So she thinks about how climate disaster affects people. And one of the very grim pieces of research that cannot be denied is that after climate disasters, wealth inequities in communities increase every time. Even when government pours money into those communities, the wealth gap increases. And she's curious about why this is. But here's the interesting piece of data. She said, what we're finding is that there is this factor of mitigation. She wants to make clear, it doesn't solve systemic racism, right? That's a big thing. But there is something that we're noticing moves the needle so that wealth disparity does not increase, hold steady, doesn't decrease either, right? That might take something more radical, but it doesn't increase. And it's communities that have developed social networks and ties with each other prior to the storm. So here is this person not involved in a faith community who says, look, this work that clergy are doing, ecumenical conversations, the sandwiches the women's group serves in the fellowship hall, the conversations you have in the neighborhoods, that actually is climate justice work. And it is making a statistical difference in how these communities recover and what resilience looks like. And this leads me to my fourth takeaway, which is that climate activism sometimes looks very different than how we have imagined it. Given this sort of commitment to connectivity and the long haul, there is a kind of musculature in the church that climate advocacy requires. And so the takeaway 4 that comes out of this class is, what would it mean to draw on spiritual disciplines to do this work? There are all kinds of practices in holistic Christian formation that lend themselves to the work of climate justice, this long haul kind of work over time. Certainly prayer, but yes, things like fasting, right? Things that say not just of food, but of luxuries, right? Of red meat, of things that say, well, I'm going to do with less for the good of the community. Sacraments, certainly, but also art and poetry, table fellowship, making those connections strong, worship. In my Methodist context, there's apportionments, right? Which is this basic idea that congregations contribute to the larger life. When a congregation has been raised with those kind of expectations, that actually our resources are meant to be shared, that provides a kind of a ground that you can have conversations about climate justice in. This is a student of mine, Reverend Tekambua, that I met during my years in Fiji. And when he preached about the climate crisis and how it was affecting his community, he begins to talk about righteousness and the different ways that righteousness looks from his context. I do need to mention a little bit about his particular island. He comes from the island of Banaba, which became inhabitable in the 20th century due to industrial British phosphate mining. So phosphate is used to enhance the soils of other nations around the world. It's used for fertilizer, but you can see just from the photographs the kind of impact it made on Banaba. And the British Empire's solution to that was to simply relocate the community about 1,000 miles away. They relocated them far away to Rambi Island in Fiji, and this is where I encountered Reverend Tekambua. Alongside very concrete conversations about fishing practices, which are part of how he understands righteousness, he describes sevu, which is a first fruits offering of taro root and Fijian yam that communities bring to the church. And he talks about the difference this makes as a climate justice piece, because it underscores the connection between God and land, and between people and land, and people and in their faith community. There is this absolute insistence from these indigenous pastors that to protect people, to protect culture, means protecting creation. And both are connected to what righteousness means in the light and witness of God. By the time we get to this point in the lecture, the work is seeming big. And so the fifth takeaway is this. What would it mean as preachers, finally, to renounce false optimism, but also to renounce despair? And both are important. So Jonathan Franzen is not a person of faith, but he writes this very chilling article a number of years ago, I believe 2019. And in it, he describes his own journey of sort of coming to an awareness that much of the losses that are coming in relation to climate can't simply be undone by public policy tweaks anymore. Doesn't mean that's not important. It doesn't mean that can't help alleviate some suffering, but that this is a serious crisis that is coming. And he begins to suggest this. He says, each of us have an ethical choice to make. During the Protestant Reformation, when end times was merely an idea and not the horribly concrete thing it is today, I would say the Reformation actually had more concrete sort of apocalyptic loss maybe than Franzen acknowledges there, but okay, his point is taken. A key doctrinal question was whether you perform good works because it will get you into heaven, because it will save you, or whether you perform them simply because they're good. And here's this person, not a person of faith, who ends his article by saying, I can respect the planet and care about the people with whom I share it without believing those actions will save me simply because they're the right thing to do. And it reminds me of this powerful reflection on the climate crisis that Chuck Campbell describes in The Scandal of the Gospel, which is his most recent book based on his Beecher lectures that engages the prophet Joel in its final chapter in relation to apocalypse. And he just notes how, yes, Joel dealing with, in his context, it was this apocalyptic experience of locusts that had destroyed the land. And Joel has all of these sort of calls of repentance to the community, right? And there are moments of promise, right? That he holds out hope. But right after those promises, there's this line, who knows? Who knows? God may relent. In other words, God is free. That we do what we do because it is righteous action, not because we have God like a puppet on a string. And the reason I think this matters so much is very often we begin to think about engaging the climate crisis, particularly for insulated communities, in such a way that we think, well, as long as we do what's right until we are insulated and we are safe, right, that we've done the job. And it hasn't allowed the conversation to go all the way down to the very basic DNA level of how we understand what it means to be human, our connections in the world and our connections to each other. Jerusha is a conservation organization that I think has done a pretty good job in going down to the roots of the problem. They have programs all around the world where they work with local indigenous communities. They draw on the wisdom and leadership of those communities to do climate work that takes a long time, but that works in transformative ways to undo the injustices of colonialism, systemic poverty in the region. Current project I just named here is the protecting of the Ottawa forest. And what that has meant over 2 decades is thinking about poaching in that area. This is in Ghana, and why that's happening and what it would mean for local communities to find new streams of sustainable economic relationships that allow for the care and protection of this treasure of biodiversity. The quote that sort of stays with me is, this kind of work is a long haul with the humble. And you don't do that when you have your eye on quick, easy, fast solutions that are going to remove the problem from the table. I think sermons can help in this work. I think sermons actually are a vital part of it. I didn't even include it on the holistic spiritual disciplines earlier because it's where we're headed. Sermons can work like parables, dislocating congregations and making them see this crisis in a new way. This is an art exhibit called Ice Watch that actually takes glacial ice that is broken off of glaciers in the North Sea and moves it to populated European cities so that people are confronted with its melting. Now think about this as an sort of symbol for what a sermon might be able to do, to bring this crisis near so people can see it, lament it, grieve it, see their reflection in it. Another image that has been speaking to me of the parable of what the sermon can do is a different art project. And this was put together by a Native American artist, Kanupa Hanska Luger, who put together the Mere Shield project for the water protectors that were protesting the Dakota Access Pipeline. Very minimally, these shields were supposed to protect the protesters from rubber bullets. There were also moments where they were held overhead and the community was filmed from above as they did this dance, beautiful spiral dance, sort of imitating a dancing water snake in the Missouri River that they were protecting. So it was a kind of claiming of relationality between the water and themselves through a ritual. But they were also designed to be held up to the faces of the militarized law enforcement officials that were confronting this community and trying to remove the protesters from the land so that they might see themselves and they might ask real questions about where they're standing in this struggle. I think sermons can do work like that. Sermons can envision the relationship, covenantal relationship that God has created amongst us. And it can also force us to look at where we are standing in this crisis. Some of the students for whom our class has been hardest are not people who are new to this conversation. They are climate advocates who have been doing this work a long time and are discouraged. I wanted to just lift up two quotes from two different climate activists who reflected at the end of the course on how their thinking about hope had changed throughout the course of the term. One says this: in the face of terrifying statistics about the damage we humans have done, we don't repent because we think we can fix it. We repent because God's love compels us. We change our habits of consumption and relation because we're practicing faithfulness, not because we expect a certain outcome. After all, this is the nature of love. Even when it's too late, love works. Wow. And another says this: I see my role as being an agent of Christian hope in the midst of the climate crisis, guiding the church in rituals of truth and action. Our current moment is a crisis, but it's also an opportunity for repentance. It's a threshold through which we can turn from our sinful ways of greed and destruction and turn back to God. There is no going back to a time pre-climate change, but we can hope that in the midst of decreation, destruction, even suffering, something beautiful might be redeemed. There's a different tenor and depth to these conversations about hope. And I think they're deeply biblical. We know something of hope that looks like this: cruciform hope that calls for commitment. Also hope that is very aligned to the ground on which your community stands. I want to get practical here at the end of my talk as we sort of move into the last move. What does it mean to preach about climate in ways that are deeply attentive to your people, and what it would mean to move them forward in this work? This question, where are we standing, which began as a question for our preachers, by the end of the course, they were asking that about their congregations. Where are we standing in the biblical text and in our local and global context? Because climate preaching is going to look different depending on where you stand. I'm gonna not do that quote right now. That's a quote from a sermon that I preached earlier this year about how one of the things sermon can do can reveal where we stand. But I actually want to move to this slide instead, because I think it's more concrete and practical for where we are today as preachers. I really appreciate this little book from John McClure, because part of what he describes in this book is that ethical preaching doesn't just look one way. And he breaks down just sort of 4 categories. There are more, not just 4, but this is a good place to start. And it allows you to begin thinking about what it is your community needs most significantly now to move forward in this conversation. So one of the ethical approaches he describes is communicative ethics, which is kind of a public theology sort of sermon, where you're trying to find common values across difference. It's often policy focused. It's often education focused. If the issue is just there's just a lack of information, and maybe there is an initiative that's coming down the pike in your community, a kind of communicative ethic is very helpful in the sermon. But there's also this witness ethic, which is a counter narrative. What would it mean to create a distinct covenantal community that understands climate justice work as discipleship, and discipleship as climate justice work? What would it mean to form a community that understood this issue as deeply rooted in its faith? That's a very different kind of sermon than a communicative ethics sermon, but it might be precisely where your community is. It might be what the link they're needing to make. There's also a liberation ethic, which is beginning to help people reframe the questions around climate, use new metaphors. Often liberation ethics stress the apocalyptic power of God. They talk about the concrete impact that this issue has on a suffering world. And finally, there's a hospitality ethic, which is a more dialogical approach in the sermon. It honors kind of a multiplicity of voices, a learning from each other, a finding truth together. This might be very helpful if you have a congregation that is in agreement that this is an issue, but they're not sure how to move forward. So perhaps they're adjudicating between 2 goods. What is the good we're called to, right? That kind of a conversation is different again. And then, of course, there is the sermon for a community that is facing the immediate trauma of environmental disaster. And some of you may be in this position even now on this call. This is a little book, came out not many years ago. Jeff Stanfill, he comes from an evangelical background, but he writes this book just out of great love for communities that have been hit by natural disasters that often have very harmful preaching following that disaster. And he takes some very basic texts and he looks at them pastorally and practically in terms of ways preachers can respond to natural disasters in their own communities. This work has to be locally rooted. It needs to be to grow out of the conversations that are happening in your community. When I have given this conversation around the Great Lakes, the issues that people raise that need to be talked about are different than what they talk about in Atlanta when I've given this conversation, or on the West Coast. The rub is going to look different given the place where you stand and your community is located. I would also say to you, preaching in transformative ways on this issue in Christian contexts requires a kind of grounding in the biblical text. This has been so helpful in terms of how to get this issue to communicate to a congregation where there has been resistance to this issue, or perhaps a numbness to this issue. It's a way to, I think, model for your community. This is not a Johnny-come-lately issue. This is not sort of political posturing. This is core to the stories we tell about who God is and what God requires of God's people. Preaching that is concretely descriptive is significant. There's this beautiful picture of a water hole, a swimming hole at the bottom, and it grows out of a sermon that we heard in our class where a preacher who is speaking to a relatively conservative congregation begins by describing this water hole where he used to go and swim in a beautiful way that you can almost feel that water on your skin, and then talks about how nobody can swim in that water anymore. It's dangerous to swim in. Those kind of images, like those giant pieces of ice melting in cities in Europe, press communities to wake up from the numbness many feel in relation to this issue. And finally, covenantally committed. And by this, I mean standing alongside your people, covenantally committed to creation, but also to each other, that there is a love for your people that has got to come through in preaching around climate. If you're really going to model a God that is covenanted with the world, what does that look like in your community? Sometimes it means reflecting together. I think a lot of things that need to happen and conversations that need to happen around climate can't always happen in the sermon. Sometimes the sermon sets up book discussions that happen later. I list just a couple of recent books here that are helpful simply in terms of their pragmatism. They don't downplay the crisis, but they're also just, they sort of break it down. They sort of ask good questions. One of the most powerful things we had our preachers do in this course after they risked preaching to their communities was we asked them to do a feedback group. We asked them to gather together about, 5 to 7 folks who had heard that sermon and give their feedback on what they heard. We let preachers know we weren't grading them on whether their congregations liked it, but we were interested in how preachers discerned what that feedback meant. How is it that they saw God working in their people? What would they have changed after listening? What would they have kept the same and doubled down on? But here's the thing we didn't anticipate. We didn't anticipate when we gave that assignment how many students would come back and tell us how ready their congregations were to have this conversation. Again, this is in a very purple state, a very divided state. And these were the kind of comments we got back. The most surprising discovery to me was how receptive congregants were to this message. Quite frankly, I was surprised by how on board everyone in the focus group was with the concept of preaching about climate change. I was surprised at some of the conversations that came about as a result of the sermon. The group's conversation on consumerism, how it contributed, was encouraging. And I was surprised at their readiness to admit culpability. In my discussion, I was struck by God's presence when a group member stated they'd heard God's pain through the pain of the earth expressed in the sermon. And then one mentions this about his own self. He said, I heard through these folks God's voice inviting me to do what I was preaching about, enter into improvisational conversation with God and the Spirit. That is, to recognize that preaching is not just a practical exercise, it's a spiritual exercise. We're now at the 1 hour mark. We have about a half hour left. And I haven't given you time to talk yet. And I know this is a group that has a lot to say. I'm going to actually give us an activity to do in our last half hour together. I'm going to describe it first, and then I'm going to sort of have Chip break us into groups. And I'm going to have you work in small groups a little bit on these questions, and then we're going to come back and we're going to share together some of the ideas in those groups. I would love for you to leave today with some practical, concrete ideas for biblical texts that you might use that address where your congregation is standing on this issue. So it's a little exercise. Which of these scenarios best fits your congregation? I put 3 down here. You can certainly have one that's not listed here, but I'm going to define these broadly, and you might find yourself in one of these. One is this is a once-a-year issue in your church. It's kind of the one branch among many kind of way to think about climate care. Maybe that's you, and you're trying to figure out, how do I talk about this more in a way that's faithful? It could be that in your congregation, there's a justice disconnect, and that can look 2 ways. It can be a congregation that's very involved in climate care, but isn't really that interested in the way that intersects justice for migrant workers or low-income communities or racial.
Uh-oh. She will be back, but I'm going to I'll just remind you what the questions are. I'll go ahead and put you in small groups as she asked. So the question is, where does your congregation fit into that scheme? Is it a racial disconnect? Is there something they're passionate about? Are you in the face of environmental challenge? And then the other question was, what scriptures come to mind to you that might be meaningful for you to bring up? So to think about not just the regular go-tos, but what part of the old story is helpful. There was a third question, but I don't remember what it was. But when Jerusha comes back, then she will tell us. I'm going to put you into groups of 3.
Chip, I screenshotted that. It was what biblical text or what part of the old story do they need to remember?
Right. Yes. Wasn't there 3 though? Weren't there 3 things?
Which of these scenarios best fits? What part of the old story do they need to remember? What biblical text would serve as helpful sermon conversation partners?
Okay, so those 2 kind of go together between the old story. So I'm going to put you in groups of 3 and 4, and enjoy your conversation.
Great. Thank you, everybody. Well, I'm sorry for disappearing. My computer just shut down, and it took me a little while to sort of get back to you, but thank you for just moving ahead, and thank you, Chip, for your leadership. Do we still have, I think we still have another group we're waiting for, or is this who we've got?
This is who we've got. Several people said they had a
That
commitment
they had
at
to leave.
11.
Okay, good. I put the questions we're talking about in the chat. Can I just, would someone be willing to share out of the conversation you all had together? I just want to walk with you through this question a little bit. Which of those scenarios spoke to where your congregation is? And what part of the old story do you think they particularly need to remember given where they're standing? Who wants to just share their thoughts on that?
Well, I'll jump in with ours. With the story for us, for what we have been doing here is the emphasis has really been on creation, that part of the old story, and emphasizing not as much the I mean, we've emphasized the crisis, we've emphasized, but really, like, what is the beauty that is there in the world right now, and how do we protect that, and how do we make sure that that is there for my kids, from if I ever have grandkids, my grandkids, theirs, and so forth. So that's the part of the story that we've, at least in our congregation, of what I shared with our group, that we really tried to emphasize.
What's the theological language that you've been using as a lens to sort of frame that beauty? How have you been talking about it?
Wonder, awe.
Yeah. What places in the biblical text draw you in as you work with that?
The creation stories, obviously, in especially Genesis 1, but also the Psalms, big time.
The Psalms are huge, aren't they? They're just massive. How does your congregation do in relation to the justice work? Do they make the connection between wonder and awe and like the work they're doing around race and poverty and all that?
We're not there yet. I think there's still that lack of knowledge of what is the ultimate effect, and something, and I can put the link in the chat. We're doing actually a week from Sunday, is we're hosting a community showing of a film called The Letter, that is a documentary film that's based on Pope Francis' encyclical about creation. It profiles 5 different people and groups who have either been significantly impacted by climate change already, or who are working to mitigate its effects. And I believe it's free on YouTube as well. So I'll put the link in the chat. But so that's something we are trying to do, and actually coming up here in a week and a half, is this community event for our congregation, but also for our community, of telling these stories.
So I'm gonna just press you a little bit toward what you don't know that you don't know yet, because you haven't planned it yet. But I'm assuming after this fantastic film, at some point there is going to be a sermon, right, that sort of follows up on it, or there might be. Is there a text that comes to mind that you can imagine might make this link, this kind of link between the beauty of creation, but also the actual on the ground dehumanization of people in relation to it? Is there a text that calls you there, or that you think would illumine that issue?
I don't know if there's one, but the 2 that just immediately came to mind were, and part of it is we're doing a sermon series on the Sermon on the Mount, is the whole consider the lilies of like, just look at what God has created in the way that this is supposed to function. But then also the Matthew 25 of, are we considering how this, our actions, are they being this? And I don't like the language of the least of these, but that's the language in there. But those 2 together.
So I hear 2 things going on in both of those texts. I don't even think, you can pair them, but I don't think you even need to, because there is this in the Matthew 25, there is the reframing of least of these in relation to creation, right? So it's making this link between the injustice against earth and injustice against people. One of the things that's compelling to me, though, about that Lily passage is it's so much about poverty. It's so much about God's care for people who do not have enough. And what does it mean that God says, look to creation, sort of not to create a passivity about it, but I think to talk about God's deep solidarity with creation all the way down. And do we have that kind of solidarity in Christian communities, not just around the beauty of the world, but around the people who are impacted by its unraveling? I think there's something powerful in that idea of consider the lilies that can bridge this gap for you, precisely because it attends to beauty for the sake of justice. That's profound.
Yeah,
that's great.
Yeah.
Is there someone else who would like to share kind of where their congregation is and some of the theological themes, the challenges that are on the horizon for them, and the biblical passages that might help them do that work? Or even just the beginning part of that, if you don't have the whole thing, just the sense of what part of the old story do they need to be reminded of in your community?
I would say the congregation.
Well, I guess. Oh,
Go ahead.
yep. No, go ahead.
I'm going to say my congregation needs to experience Pentecost
Beautiful.
again. Because my first impression of presenting this to them is they'll say, we're too small, we're too tired, we're too, we are unwilling to make this one more plank in our program.
Yeah.
And how can we use it to increase membership growth?
Yeah, I hear you. Thank you. Oh, that's profound. So the place where your congregation is standing is a kind of weariness, a kind of overwhelm, a kind of vision that has become smaller and smaller and focused on its own sustenance and survival. What would it mean to remind them again of the animating, empowering, enlivening Spirit of God? So a lot of the work in the book that I'm currently doing is on Ezekiel. And of course, Ezekiel also has this strong sort of emphasis
the prophets of PTSD,
right? And I think of the Ezekiel 37 passage in relation to Pentecost, particularly in light of how you describe your congregation. What would it mean to do a Pentecostal remembering that brought on board the revivifying, resurrecting power of the Spirit, even in this exilic place of loss? What's profound about that Ezekiel 37 for me is after they all get on their feet, there are these promises about place, about again, this covenantal connection between creation and people together. And God's Spirit does that. God's Spirit first brings to life and then reminds that actually your identity is connected to this work. Great. Thank you so much. Bringing on the Spirit, James. I appreciate it. Jim, you had a comment.
Jim Porter.
Yes. Where my congregation is and what I mentioned in our small group was seeing this as a justice issue, and not just for ourselves, but for others as well. I live in northern Michigan. It's a beautiful resort area on Lake Michigan. There's lots of wealth here. We frequently talk about how blessed we are, to live in this beautiful part of the country. But I think the challenge is, helping the congregation see environmental care as not just care for the part of the planet where we are, but to have that broader vision, and recognizing that care for the planet also means we need to care for our brothers and sisters who are suffering so much
Yes.
from the climate change, that is happening all around the world.
Jim, I'm so glad you bring this up. Interestingly, twice now, 2 different summers, different resort communities on Lake Michigan have had me come and do a sort of whole week of lectures on climate. And it has been the problem you name, I have experienced firsthand. So, for example, the issue in many of these communities is not a denial that this is happening. One family said, well, we're just sort of selling, our family's land in Texas, and we're buying up all the land here around the Great Lakes because we know we're going to need, our family and my children are going to need water. Well, no, the point is not convincing them there's a problem. The point is convincing of the responsibility to, folks that cannot buy up the land around Lake Michigan and aren't going to have.
Right.
And so there is this, and this is really where I think Dr. Davis's work around covenant is really key. What does it mean to remember again our covenantal responsibility to each other? It's not just about whether I'm okay at the end of the day, but how do I live in such a way that my faith reflects this covenanting God that made God's self vulnerable to a world, and how does that look lived out on the ground? One of the I had a woman who came up to me after one of those lectures in one of those communities and said, we have a private beach in this community, and we're very protective of it. And there's a whole community of First Tribes, sort of First Nations, right, that is nearby. And where this would hit the road, the rubber would hit the road for a community would be to imagine what would it mean to sort of work on reconciliation with these First Nations populations in ways that were actually sacrificial. I mean, if sharing your beach is sacrificial, but that's where this community was, right? Like, what would it mean? Think about our land as shared, even within boundaries, and what does that mean? Anyway, all of that to say, these conversations are deeply contextual. They're fraught. The ways that power and awe and wonder all intersect are significant. If you would like more resources also about the relation of power and sort of the imperial narrative in relation to this, I mentioned Preston Burroughs' work on Rome. Also Barbara Rossing, who was on a slide, but her work on Revelation, she goes back to this again and again and again. And I think that that's more sort of confronting than the covenantal path. It's more deconstructive than constructive. But I think it is also helpful in exposing how deep this issue goes in the way power works in our world. So thank you so much. We are at time. Thank you to those who shared. I know you had robust generative conversations in your groups as well. I'm so grateful to have been here with you today. Thank you so much.
And let's give Jerusha some happy hands and thank her. And Jerusha, can you stick around if people have specific, if they'd like to interact with you one-on-one?
For a little bit. I've got a meeting, to come in.
All right.
For let's say 10 minutes. 10 minutes, I'll be around.
Great. And but before we get to that 10 minutes, I want to introduce Rebecca Barnes to you. She has been at this whole workshop, but she resources these issues for the Presbyterian Church USA. And I want to invite her to share about those resources. And Rebecca, you put a bunch of things into the chat for me, but not for everybody. So if you'd like to put those to everybody, and I'll also include them in the email, but go ahead and tell us for a couple of minutes what you have to offer.
Yeah, I just wanted briefly to let folks know, if you're looking because your congregation likes really Presbyterian specific things, the Hunger Program is one of the major offices that resources climate change. And one of our partners that we work with is Blessed Tomorrow. And it's a group that offers a clergy cohort and climate ambassador training. So I just put that in the chat, and I sent Chip some other things, but we have compiled climate resources and things that people could use. And we also have stories of the grant partners around the world we have. Jerusha shared some great stories of communities making a difference. And we also have gotten to hear some pretty powerful stories from our partners in the US and around the world doing what they can in their location to connect climate and justice and faith. And so are happy to share those stories if there are particular stories you're looking for. One, the typhoon that hit in the spring in Malawi really washed away a lot of the progress one of our partners was making, but they told this really powerful story that local people knew to climb in the trees because the trees would save them as everything was being washed away, that the tree roots went deeply enough into the ground that they would stand strong. And that's how some people were saved from death. So there have just been some of those really beautiful stories that help us connect things. So I sent some links to Chip, who can send them in a follow-up email, but just also wanted to introduce myself. So if you want any follow-up Presbyterian resources, we would love that.
Could you put your email address in the chat, please, Rebecca? And thank you all very much. It'll be rebecca.barnes@pcusa.org. But if you all, thank you so much for your attention. You're welcome to stay and interact with Jerusha one-on-one for a few minutes, and you're welcome to go if you need to get on with your day. So thank you so much.
I just wanted to ask a question about powers and principalities.
Yes.
And about connecting the idea of sin as more of a connected systemic issue rather than a personal and embodied issue. And I think that's something that I think is hard for my congregation to grapple with.
Yeah, thank you. Well, and it's going to be hard for me to wipe my forever grin off my face talking to you, Amy Snow, because we're long friends.
Yeah.
Well, I don't mean to be grinning as you're talking about the powers and principalities.
Oh, no.
Serious.
Right.
Okay. Yeah. I mean, this is precisely where preaching from the whole of Scripture is particularly valuable. And where the conversations around empire touch down. There's the power and principality stuff in Paul, that sort of references the powers that put Jesus on the cross. There's also spiritual powers that work, but sometimes they're quite concrete. There's a disarming of them on the cross. There's that kind of apocalyptic language. But you almost have more descriptive grit in these pictures that the Bible paints of what it is when empires start playing God. And there's several in Scripture. One of the most powerful verses in Revelation is this description. It's near the end. The reference is actually on that slide, but it's near the end of the book, and it's this weeping that the merchants of the world are doing for the loss of Babylon's sort of ships and its resources, and it starts naming all of the things that these ships carry. The ships carry this beautiful wood and these beautiful gems and this beautiful cloth, and we're weeping, and then it gets to the end, and it says and human flesh. And you realize that in this entire economy that Revelation is describing, slavery lies at its root, that these two things are connected. This is, of course, true with Egypt too. It's also true in the Babylon and Ezekiel's day, right? There's these very particular examples of how there are social political implications for a kind of disregard for our connectivity with the earth, with creation. And it very quickly turns into the kind of systemic, taking on a life of its own injustices that fuel the worst of humanity's sins. So I think there are ways in which to begin talking about the context of some of this stuff. There are winsome, accessible ways to open up the context of texts and when they were written that help people see there's conversations happening here that are actually really similar to conversations that we're having today about, the largest forced migrations in history, the loss of arable land, the fight around water. These basic conversations, these are actually in the background of many of our texts, and just under the surface. And we've been reading them sort of as metaphors or sort of spiritualizing them for a long time. And because of that, we're missing the relevance.
Mm-hmm.
To move from a recycling sermon to a sermon that says, actually, we need to remember at a very core level our connection. I'm thinking as I talk of this revelation that was so clear to us during COVID, that if my neighbor is not safe from this, I'm not safe. If my neighbor doesn't have good health care or a job that allows them to stay home when they're sick, like, all of us are in danger. This was so clear to us during COVID, and that hasn't changed. And the scripture just testifies to that over and over and over again. Thank you, Amy.